So as Brittany said, my specialty is on the 1960s civil rights Black Power movement. Sometimes we say there are two movements. Sometimes we say there was only one movement, the long civil rights movement. Some people say it started in 1954 with Brown. Some say it started in 1945 after World War II. Some say no, it couldn't start after World War II. What about E. Philip Randolph in 1941? Then we start arguing again about the 1920s with Garvey. So we don't know when it started and has it ended? No. So what we call the Black freedom struggle is long and deep, and it started on the slave ships and it continues right now. That's the history of the Black freedom struggle. And I want to just sort of contextualize the 1960s. As you guys may know, that the story is often told on the tales of two philosophies or two aspects of the 1960s Black social movements. One being deeply rooted in nonviolent direct action, and the other one deeply rooted in something called Black power, Black consciousness. And they often appear as polar opposites, but in fact, they are part of the same long thrust by Black people in the United States. And one of the things that I find so interesting about Black oppression and white responses to it is the way in which white people will typically say that we can't give in to your demands. So we can't give you what you are actually asking for, which is better job opportunities, better housing, etc. What they often say is that we don't even want to listen to your concerns. We don't even want you to voice your opinions and your perspectives about what it means to be a second-class citizen. That as an African American subject in the United States, you still have no rights to protest and to agitate, but you actually have no right to raise your voice to these issues. And that's one of the most damning things about this country, is that if you even look at the situation now, if you really focus on the opposition to Black Lives Matter or any social movement or organizing tendencies today, the response from the wider society is to shut up. As that remark was made to LeBron James by a conservative commentator. Just shut up and play ball. Just shut up and be comfortable with your lot and your position in this country. And as long as you do that, there will be peace and civility. That will be our interpretation. But that's not what happened in the 1960s. Multiple generations rose up. But the story that I wanted to focus on, 10, 15 minutes, I'll be brief, is that I really am a scholar of the period that focuses on how white people respond. I do talk about Black movements. I am interested in that. That is important. But I'm also deeply fascinated with white counter responses and white counter protests, because often that's where the action is. And what I mean by action, not so much the backlash, the political backlash, the law enforcement backlash, but certainly the way in which ordinary white people feel about your attempts to raise concerns about your life in the country. And so the riots, to me, represent, or the commentary around the riots, represent a moment where white society, particularly white public officials, decided that we have found a solution to deal with the philosophy and the practice of Black power. We will blame the urban disturbances on Stokely Carmichael, on A.Trap Brown, on others who were crisscrossing the United States, trying to speak a certain kind of truth to power about Black conditions in the urban North and West, again, a continuation of the same kind of discourse and conversation that was being had in the South. But these young brothers and sisters wanted to tell us about what black folks were feeling and what they were going through in North Minneapolis, in the Harlems, in the Philadelphias, in the Detroits, in the St. Paul's, Central St. Paul. And the only way that they could articulate that, or not the only way, but the way they chose to do it was with some form of stridency and militancy. And so the rhetorical levels of their language and their discourse came across as radical, but they were no more radical than Dr. Martin Luther King. Actually, it was Dr. King that said, the riots are the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear just what brothers and sisters were saying in these northern and western cities, right? So what I focused on is the way in which the federal government went after black power activists. So it's interesting to listen to Brittany talk about Mayor Naplan and his response, which in many ways was a rare response. And maybe that was a response that can only happen at a local level. At the national level, the response was much different. It was to lock them up. It was to throw them in jail. It was to chase these brothers and sisters around the country and around the world to get them to shut up. It was an attempt to criminalize an entire movement in a way that wasn't being done to the nonviolent direct action. Those brothers and sisters went to jail, protested, marched, but this is a whole nother level. And I want to read you something that I've been working on, just to give you a sense on how serious they were in terms of locking brothers and sisters up. So beginning after the Newark and Detroit riots in July 1967, the two biggest riots in July 1967, that month is important because that's the second disturbance, the urban disturbance and the riots that took place here in Minneapolis. So beginning after the Newark and Detroit riots in July 1967, the government was especially interested in the possibility of using federal statutes to put limits on permissible free speech by activist leaders like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown. While Congress held hearings on the anti-riot bill, the White House and the Justice Department explored the possibility of prosecuting black power speech makers that traveled the country. Both Congress and the Johnson administration believed speeches by Carmichael and Brown had gone beyond the reasonable limits of free speech and warranted immediate action by the federal government to restrict such speech. As requested by President Johnson, the Department of Justice conducted an investigation into the legal remedies that could possibly aid in the indictment and prosecution of Carmichael and Brown, or both. The investigation considered in detail 5 federal statutes that may have been violated by Carmichael and Brown, explaining the theoretical legal arguments in support and in opposition of the indictment and prosecution under those statutes. The Johnson administration casted their legal net far and wide, desiring to charge Carmichael and Brown with seditious conspiracy. Just listen to these statutes that were already on the books. The anti-riot statute was being debated in 66, 67. It would eventually pass in 1968 to deal with some other activists in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. And so they would tie up folks who were part of the Chicago 8 that was reduced to the Chicago 7. I won't talk about that, but just listen to the statutes that were already on the books to try to go after these brothers and sisters. Seditious conspiracy, inciting rebellion, overthrowing the government, and interfering with the military operations of the United States Armed Forces during the time of war. The legal theories were supported by an examination of the governing case law and legislative histories of the statutes and how they apply to the actions of Carmichael and Brown. The investigation provided recommendations regarding the potential outcomes if the government decided to proceed with legal action. but the Justice Department's investigations proved futile, leaving only the Anti-Riot Act, debated in late 1967 and passed in 1968, with the only remedy in out course. So this research is a legal history of Black power and seeks to explore the prosecutorial history of Black speech by the federal government. How free is Black speech? It wasn't free at all in the 1960s, especially in the late 1960s. Not only reflected the kinds of acts African Americans engaged in Black free speech, Black power speech, it also underscored how white political authorities responded to such political speech. Maligning and caricaturing Black power expression, white elected officials laid the history of civil disturbances in the mid-1960s at the feet of Black activists. And I just go on to say, consequently, I want to shed light on the connection between Black political speech, urban riots, and the law, particularly the Anti-Riot Act of 1968. The question becomes, do you have a right as a citizen of the United States to speak your own special truth? The answer in the 1960s to that question was no. What is the answer today? And as a sidebar, I'm going to wrap up right now, but just to give you a sense of how devious the federal government was. Stokely Carmichael comes to the University of Minnesota in May of 1967. He gives a speech to about 25,000 people at Williams Arena. May 1967. North Minneapolis goes up in flames in July. Guess what they said, who was responsible for North Minneapolis going up in flames? Stokely Carmichael. Now you tell me how the hell they connected a May speech on the campus of U of M, what took place right around these parts in July. That's how serious they were in terms of going after these brothers and sisters to try to shut them up. Thank you, I'll stop there.